Ancient India, like ancient Greece and ancient China, was one of those places in the ancient world that answered the big questions of humanity. Why are we here? How do we live a moral life? What is the scope and size of the earth? How do we measure time? These sort of big questions are answered only by a few great civilizations. But the world at large is very familiar with the answers given by the Greeks. China has also been extremely good at telling its story. The whole story of the Silk Road, which supposedly crossed the thin waste of Asia, is one which, particularly in the last 40 years, has not only been promulgated over and over again, but which has been weaponized by the Chinese state, by Xi Jinping, who has used it as the basis for the sort of Chinese hegemony over the Belt and Road. India, in comparison, is in a frustrating situation where everyone here knows about Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta and the achievements of ancient India, but it's not something which has successfully traveled out of India and been taught elsewhere. I've just come back from a book tour around Britain and Australia. No one there, except the Indians in the audience, have ever heard of Brahmagupta or Aryabhatta. The achievements of ancient Indian science are known here, but not elsewhere. And one of the things that I've been trying to do while writing this book is work out why that is. To a certain extent, I think it's the story of Victorian Indology, Macaulay's attitudes that a single shelf of good English books is worth the entire native literature of India and Arabia. We laugh at that now, but those attitudes linger on in the education system. The fact that every English kid and every American kid knows about Archimedes and his bath by the age of 7, shouting Eureka, and knows about Pythagoras and pi, but no one there has ever heard of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. And no one there is remotely aware where their own number systems come from. We call them the Arabic number system because Europe got it from the Arabs. But no one outside India, no one at all knows that it came from India. And I think the frustration of this has led to the kind of Sanjeev Bhaskar, goodness gracious me character, the uncle shouting, Leonardo da Vinci, Indian, Jesus Christ, Indian, royal family, Indian, and so on. But also to the kind of school of WhatsApp history that leads to nuclear weapons in the Mahabharata and helicopters in the Ramayana and Vedic internet available from the kind of geo of the rishis. And again, it's a comic thing, and yet it's based on a feeling that there is this great civilization. And people are not taught properly about it, particularly outside India. For me, the revelation about the scale of the Indosphere came when I was sent this picture. This is a newly excavated head of the Buddha. As you can see, very instantly recognizable. But it was dug up in an excavation in Egypt. The marble itself comes from the Marmara Sea, opposite Istanbul. The drilling of what the archaeologists nicely call the tortellini curls of the Buddha is made in a workshop in Alexandria, of all places. And it was dug up in a temple to the goddess Isis on the shores of the Red Sea, in a place which is now known to be the major port of Roman trade with India and vice versa. I got this picture sent to me when I was in Angkor Wat, which is 6,000 miles east of India, also shows the influence of India in the other corner of the world. Here, as you wander through the largest Hindu temple in the world, because that's what Angkor Wat is, it's a Vishnu temple originally, though today, of course, it's a Buddhist monument. You see images of stories first told by the Jamuna or the Yamuna, the Ganges or the Yamuna, but which are now sitting by the banks of the Mekong. Images of Kurukshetra, images of the Battle of Lanka, images of Krishna and the gopis. What are they doing 6,000 miles to the east of India, any more than what is the head of the Buddha doing in ancient Egypt? And I think the full reach of Indian influence in antiquity is something that we haven't really comprehended, although much of it is obviously there in plain sight. Why is the Hinduism in Bali? Why is the whole of Southeast Asia Buddhist? Why does Buddhism extend beyond Southeast Asia to Korea and Japan, Mongolia and Siberia? How come the whole world now uses a system of numbers invented in India? These are ideas that should be well known, not only to Indians, but to the whole world, but they're not. And coming back to this idea of the Silk Road, I think this is a very important reason why in the last 40 years people do not know about the influence of India. Look at this map. This is taken at random from one of the many books on the Silk Road published in the last 20 years. There are 20 or 30 published every year. And this one, as you can see, shows this map set apparently in antiquity because the monuments and the cities recorded, particularly on the left-hand side of the map, are cities which didn't exist by the 5th or 6th century. Petra, Palmyra. And it crosses right across Persia and Central Asia and ends up in Loyang. But India plays no part in this map. India, in fact, plays no part at all. It's just the Himalayas. There's no cities there. And even the maritime Silk Road, which is a new addition to this story, the dotted line at the bottom, bypasses India. It goes through the straits between Sri Lanka and Tamil Nadu, and it doesn't stop off. It just heads off towards the Mediterranean. So compare this map. Memorize this in your heads and compare it with this map. So this map is a new map produced by the Archaeology Department of Oxford this summer. It's a map of actual finds of Roman coins, Roman coin hoards. As you can see, as you'd expect, Italy, Spain, France, the Balkans, Greece, the Levantine coast, North Africa, falling off to the north as you enter Scandinavia and northern Germany, falling off to the south as you enter the Sahara, but with a little trickle down the Nile. Let's see whether the pointer works. Yeah, not very clearly, but a few little bit of action around Yemen, a scattering of finds in Afghanistan, nothing in China, but look at India, riddled with Roman coin hoards. This map is part of a reassessment of the influence of ancient Indian trade and ancient Indian, the reach of ancient Indian merchants, because no Roman coin hoard has ever been found in China. But India and Sri Lanka were the principal trading partners of the Roman Empire. We now know we've now begun reassessing classical authors such as Pliny, who says very clearly that every year 55 million sestertii pour from the Roman treasury into Indian pockets. Or Strabo, Roman geographer, or Greek geographer based in Alexandria during Roman times, more accurately, who goes on a tour of Egypt with the new governor, and he states very clearly that he sees in the Red Sea ports 250 vessels waiting for the winds to change to allow them to sail to India. A fleet of 250 vessels. So compare that solid citing by Strabo to the complete absence of any evidence of Roman trade with China. We don't know of a single embassy from China to Rome or vice versa. We don't know of a single trading expedition from Rome to China or vice versa. The real action, as this map shows, is India to the Roman Empire. And this is a major source of money and information to the Roman world. We're going to come back here. But first, I'm going to talk under three headings tonight. The spread of Buddhism, the spread of Hinduism and Sanskrit and that whole package to Southeast Asia, and thirdly, the story of mathematics. So let's start. We're going to have a canter through this in just half an hour. So let's go on a gallop, first of all, through Buddhism. So the Buddha is a historical character. He lives in the mid-5th century BCE, or possibly the late 4th century BCE. The reason there's some confusion about this is that Buddhism is almost archaeologically invisible for its first 200 years. There's no epigraphy. There's absolutely no confirmed sites until Ashoka appears, when it's suddenly all changed. From a complete absence of epigraphy, we have words flowing in waterfalls over the rock shelters, the pillars, and the monuments of Ashoka, along with these very, very substantial, slightly Persianate Mauryan finds. Before Ashoka, there's very little evidence of Buddhism spreading much beyond the Gangetic Plains. It's mainly around Lumbini, Sarnath, Bodh Gaya. But after this, we know that, according to an inscription in Kandahar, that Ashoka sends out Dharma ministers, in our language, missionaries, as far as Cyrene, which is Libya. So in the post-Alexander world, you have this enormous spread of ancient Indian influence, because with the ideas of Buddhism comes a whole package of Indian ideas about karma, about cosmology, about geography, about time. And it's not just to the north and just to the Macedonian world. It's also down through the width of India. It's at this period you get the first rock temples cut into the Western Ghats around here, particularly around Pune. Not only the famous Ajanta, these murals are a little bit later, but the first Ajanta caves are from this period. And then just a couple of hours from here, the wonderful rock-cut monasteries of Baja outside Pune. But it's also at this period you find Buddhism and Indian ideas spreading southwards into Sri Lanka. Ashoka sends his son Mahinda, who preaches outside Anuradhapura and converts the king of Sri Lanka. There's major discoveries happening in Sri Lanka at the moment, including this early stupa belonging to Mahinda himself, recently discovered on the hilltop of Rajagala in the jungles of central Sri Lanka with a Brahmi inscription. And this is a kind of prototype to the later stupa, of which we're much more familiar, on the left, with the one perfect bell shape. Look at this, just a jumble of stones, but that's how it starts. A jumble of stones over the cremation of a missionary. And by the time that Ashoka dies, Sri Lanka has become a major missionary center for Buddhism too. And this is the miracle that follows. Now, this is a proper map of how influence actually travels in the ancient world. Forget that mythical road, the Silk Road, which never existed at this period. This is a map of the influence spreading out. And what a miracle. Look at it, coming from the Gangetic Plain up to Pakistan, Gandhara, Afghanistan, Bactria, across Dunhuang to Chang'an, out to Korea and Japan, southwards through Burma, Siam, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Guangzhou, even to the Philippines. And this happens within a matter of decades. It's an extraordinary moment in world history. Then, by about 100 BC, India and Rome are so closely interlinked that you can get this map. This is a map based on the kind of lonely planet of the first century. It's called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea. And this map shows the intimate knowledge of the Romans of the whole west coast of India, including Sopra, Kalyan, and Chaul, around these parts. They know every detail, to the point they know about the kink of the king of Barigaza in Gujarat, who has a great taste for Roman singing boys. They know all the details of every port, which needs tugboats or pilots to help get into the ports. And it isn't, of course, just Egypt here's Berenike, which is the main port where the Buddha's head turns up, Myos Hormuz, where Strabo saw the 250 vessels. There's also, we shouldn't forget, Ethiopia. Here are Ethiopians coming to one of the courts of ancient India. This is Amaravati. And we have this very handsome, tall Ethiopian with his cornrow hair and his young pages offering gifts to an Indian king. Again, a sort of forgotten moment. Here is where we're talking about Adulis, Meroe, Aksum. This was very much part of this world too. But this map also helpfully shows the thing that gives India its edge at this period. This enormous area of Tibet. It freezes over now in November. Cold winds rake in. Then it thaws again every spring in March and April, and warm winds blow out. And those bellows over this vast area of the Tibetan plateau creates the monsoon winds that disrupt all your lives every monsoon, but also allowed Indian sailors to sail out at speed. It took only 2.5 months, if you use the monsoon correctly, to move from Maziris in Kerala right up to Berenike and Myas Hormuz and to join the trade with Rome. And you find influence moving in both directions. But we also know the figures now. The Maziris papyrus found 20 or 30 years ago, now in Vienna, is the sort of thing that's produced in this city every day. It's a shipping invoice about one container on one ship, the Hermapilon, that sailed from Maziris in Kerala about 120 AD. That container had 120 tons of ivory, 10 amphora full of black pepper, cotton, silk, nard, which is used in Roman perfumery, extremely expensive luxury product, and various other things, amounting to such a vast sum of money that if that container had successfully made it to Rome and Egypt, the recipient could have bought effectively the largest estate in Egypt or in central Tuscany and have enough spare change to join the Senate. He could become the Elon Musk of, God help us, of... And we don't also, and this is very important, not only did it make anyone engaged in this trade incredibly rich, we know that it also made the Roman state rich because of the customs duty. And this document has the quarter share given to the customs. And that quarter share is so vast now that economic historians are calculating that maybe as much as a quarter of the entire Roman imperial budget came from the customs at Berenike and Myas Hormuz, from luxury imports from India. Your ancestors diddled my ancestors so badly and so inflated the values of their goods that the poorer the Roman state was able to use that money, the quarter share of the customs, to build Hadrian's Wall, the Appian Way, the whole Roman road system, the forts in Algeria, the Rhine frontier. So it was a major money spinner. And we have records of this. For example, in Sicily, some merchant rich on the Indian trade draws a picture, not draws a picture, but makes a mosaic, commissions a mosaic is what I'm trying to say, of the things that have made him super rich in one of the biggest and richest villas in Sicily. And at the center is a personification of India, this very voluptuous lady who is just a Roman version of a Yakshi. And just as the Yakshi here from Mathura is holding on to a tree, because she's a tree spirit and a figure of fertility, and the sign of the fertility is that the tree buds, there's the bud, when she touches it. And that motif goes through into Rajput painting and Mughal painting for centuries later. Anyway, here's the Roman version of it. She's holding the tree, you see. Behind her is pepper, which is the most lucrative of all things, very easy to grow here, and can be rather like sort of petrol in Saudi Arabia today, or you can get it pick it off the trees for nothing and sell it for vast quantities in the Roman world. But there's also silk, ivory, elephants and tigers for the Colosseum, and malabathrum, which is a plant for scent. And these were things of enormous value, slightly like the equivalent of, I don't know, you get stuck at Heathrow, your plane Air India or BA gets cancelled, and you go and visit the duty free, and you buy all sorts of incredibly unnecessary luxuries, rubbish Japanese whiskey, overly inflated when you should be buying nice scotch, and expensive French perfumery. This was the equivalent. And Pliny talks about it in those terms. Pliny says, what is this newfangled and most immoral textile, silk, that allows you to see a woman's figure beneath it? Look, here we are. We can see her ankle. Look, very, very big come on if you're a Roman, that. And what is this black powder that the young are sprinkling on their food, this pepper? And he's that sort of old conservative who doesn't like anything newfangled. But he says, India is the drain of all the precious metals in the world. And with this, we see this influence spreading. You see in excavations across Europe, luxury furniture, the more yakshis, from sort of vaguely sort of pornographic figures from India found in Pompeii. But you also find the reverse. Here we have Alexandrian Egyptian glassware found in all places in Afghanistan, brought to Barbaricum, where Karachi is today, at the mouth of the Indus, punted up the Indus through the Kabul River, and this turns up under the American Air Force Base at Bagram. Also porphyry from the mountain of porphyry, Mons Porphyrius in Egypt, the most expensive stone in the Roman world. But we find the influence of art too. So here's a Coptic image from Egypt of Jesus and his disciples at the bottom, and an almost identical image of the Buddha and his disciples found at Miran, the only Gandharan site to have wall paintings surviving. And it is through the influence of Rome, scholars now think, that transforms Buddhist art. For the first 3 centuries of Buddhism, of Buddhist art, the Buddha is not shown as an iconic figure. He's shown as a stupa, as a pillar of flame, or as the wheel of the law, or indeed a pair of feet, or indeed an empty throne. But suddenly, in the 1st century, we get a figure very like Apollo turning up in the Bimaran reliquary. And in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, we get these increasingly classical-looking faces in Gandharan sculpture. This guy could be a Roman senator. Look at him. And if you compare Augustus and the drapery around him with the drapery on the bodhisattvas, it's almost identical. So that old Victorian idea that Gandharan art was the lost legions of Alexander the Great, stuck in the Hindu Kush, they convert to Buddhism, seems to be nonsense. This is contemporary Roman art influencing Indian art, the two coming together, and together these forms of art head up into China, where you begin to get Indic monasteries in Afghanistan. Mez-Ainak on a copper deposit outside Kabul, Bamiyan, where the Taliban blew up the Buddha, but whose whole rock face is riddled with the desert, the caves of monks, tens of thousands of monks. And as you head towards China, you come across more and more Indian influence heading into China. From the 1st century, the first Buddhist art begins to come to China, but brought by foreigners. It's a foreign religion. This is changed by the 5th century when you get heavy influence of Gupta aesthetics. This is the gorgeous figure of a bodhisattva with his belly button, his little pajama line, and the folds of the cloth being copied directly by Chinese artists in Gansu. Soon you have very Ajanta-style Indian deities floating over the domes of Buddhist monasteries in Gansu and in Western China. Some of the monks have clearly been smoking something pretty strong, judging by this picture, and indeed, where the hell does the blue elephant come from? But by the 5th century, Buddhism has made an inroads in the Chinese court. It's a minority faith. It's far less influential than Confucianism or Taoism, but that will change. And the person who changes that is this unlikely figure of Xuanzang. Xuanzang with his natty backpack full of scrolls, his little torch, I love the little torch, hanging from the top of the backpack. wanders from China. He's the kind of nerdy figure who minds about the exact grammar of the Buddha's words. And he comes to India because he is worried that the Buddhist texts in China are corrupted. And where does he go? He goes to Nalanda, to the gorgeous University of Nalanda, the largest center of learning in Asia. 6 kings built as many monasteries around the sites, one after another. An enclosure was made with bricks to merge them into one monastery. There were separate courtyards divided into 8 departments. Precious terraces ranged like stars in the sky, and jade-storied pavilions spired to lofty peaks. But look at the courtyard. What does that remind you of? Where have you seen a university with a courtyard, a cloister garth, and scholars' rooms? This is like every Oxbridge college. And that is not a joke, because there is very good evidence that this plan moved from the viharas of Buddhism through the madrasas of early Islam, which begin in Afghanistan and spread to North Africa, and finally enter Europe in the 12th century on the borders of Islamic Spain, Bologna, Salerno, Paris, and then finally Oxford and Cambridge. So this plan, which in Oxford and Cambridge is of course a lawn in the center, plausibly could have its origins in Nalanda in Bihar, along with the idea of a university. But the thing that most excites Xuanzang when he gets there is the library. 9 stories high, which teach not just the minutiae of Mahayana Buddhism, and that was what Xuanzang was after. He wanted to know about the Yogacara texts. But it also teaches the Vedas, logic, grammar, philosophy, medicine, metaphysics, divination, mathematics, Sanskrit, astronomy, literature, and magic. It was 9 stories high and contained 3 divisions: the Ratnadadi, the Sea of Jewels, the Ratnasagara, the Ocean of Jewels, and the Ratnarajika, the Jewel Adorned. The priests of numbers 7,000 from morning until night engage in discussions. The old and the young mutually help each other. The students diligently studied without wasting a moment. No fresher arriving at Oxbridge or Harvard has ever been more thrilled than Xuanzang was with this monastery. And he spends 20 years there copying out this extraordinary set of manuscripts, which anyone can borrow, and they have to put it back in the niche in the evening in the central courtyard. But it's like this extraordinary center of learning, the likes of which he's never seen. And indeed, it became, in the generation afterwards, so famous that you get the king of Srivijaya giving this copper plate. Srivijaya is Indonesia. The king of Indonesia gives 100 villages to Nalanda to set up an expatriate college for the use of Southeast Asian monks. But it wasn't just Southeast Asian monks. They come from Nepal, Tibet, Sri Lanka, Sumatra, Korea. So this is a major international center of higher learning. Incredible place. And when he goes home, Xuanzang gets all these manuscripts back, and the emperor, Taizong, builds the Wild Goose Pagoda, which is still there in Xi'an to this day. But the most improbable ally he has is this woman, Wu Zetian, who is only a 15-year-old concubine when Xuanzang gets back. But amazingly, it is her who makes Buddhism the state religion of China. Now, it's difficult to work out how she did it looking at these old pictures, but you get perhaps a slightly better idea looking at the modern Chinese soap opera based on the... It all makes sense, huh? So Wu Zetian is a hottie, okay? And she jumps from the bed of Taizong to his son Gaizong. Let's just look at the Chinese soap opera and forget about the pictures. Gaizong withdraws her from the nunnery into which she'd been shoved with the old empresses and the other concubines after his father's died. She brings him back into his bed, where almost immediately he fathers a child with her. 6 months later, that child is found strangled. There is an investigation, and the finger of suspicion points to the empress and the then chief concubine. They are sentenced to death, they have their bones broken, and they are drowned in a vat of wine. Wu comes empress in their stead. And according to later Confucian accounts, it was she who murdered her own baby to frame them. So she's a piece of work. And then Gaizong has a series of mysterious strokes. And guess who takes over? Wu Zetian. And then he dies completely, again in slightly suspicious circumstances. And Wu Zetian springs a coup d'etat with the help of Xuanzang's Mahayana monks, trained at Nalanda. And you get effectively an Indian Buddhist coup d'etat in the court at China. And all the Buddhist monks come up with bogus prophecies that Wu Zetian is actually the reincarnation of the Bodhisattva Maitreya, that she's the Devi, been prophesied for generations. They're all rewarded, of course, for this sort of bogus prophecies. And for 40 years, China becomes a Buddhist state, thanks to her. She brings in other alumni from Nalanda. The chief astronomer becomes a guy called Siddhartha Gautama. A whole set of figures like this are brought in. And it is, if you like, the high watermark of Indian influence in China. It's rolled back a bit after that. But Buddhism remains at the center of Chinese life ever since, and it is today still in China that you find most of the world's Buddhists. But as I say, it isn't just Buddhism. With Buddhism comes these ideas of yugas and kalpas and karma, a whole set of ideas of cosmology and time and religion and geography travel as part of this package, bringing Indian influence into the heart of China. And from there, it goes to Japan and Korea, onto Mongolia and Siberia. So it's a hugely important moment in world history. And the same thing is happening in Sri Lanka in a slightly different way, with Hinduism and Hindu kingship and the Sanskrit language. Remember, we were talking about how important Roman trade was to India, how it produced generations of gold, which is still being found by archaeologists today. Pepper and ivory were to ancient India what petroleum is to Saudi Arabia. But the end of the Roman Empire ends that, slightly like, just to return to Elon Musk, slightly like Tesla and battery cars might end Saudi Arabia's dominance today. And it produces, in the 5th century, the fall of Rome produces a massive economic crisis in India. All the gold that's been pouring in for 400 years stops dead. Like that. So what happens is that the Tamil trading guilds pivot eastwards. And these guys are quite badass. The Tamil trading guilds have a core of assassins that track down anyone that kills their members. They found their own little trading stations with their own mercenary soldiers, rather like the East India Company. And more particularly, they look for new sources of gold. And they find them at Palembang, Keling, Kutai, Bujang in Malaysia, Ok Eo on the Mekong Delta, Champa in Vietnam. And this area becomes known as Savarna Bhumi, the lands of gold. Sarawak becomes Savarna Dvipa. Sugriva in the Ramayana tells Hanuman, you will go to the Savarna Dvipa and you will find gold everywhere. The Jatakas are full of mentions of Savarna Bhumi. Today, of course, it's the name of the airport in Bangkok. No, it is from this. It is directly from this. And so the absence of gold in India after the fall of the Roman Empire leads to this massive swing eastwards in ships like this, constructed from wood and sewed together with coconut fiber. These boats head out using the same monsoon winds, but this time traveling eastwards in the 5th and 6th centuries. And suddenly you start finding evidence of Indian religions. 1,000 years after the death of the Buddha, suddenly it arrives in Thailand. These are the Dvaravati wheels of law from southern Thailand. In the Bujang Valley, where I was last week in Malaysia, we get early Buddhist bronzes. We get Shiva lingams with the Mukhalinga faces on them. We get yonis, and we get images of Lord Shiva in gold. 5th and 6th century, but particularly the center goes to the Mekong Delta. Ok Eo on what's now the Vietnamese side, and Angkor Beret, which is this little hill on the Cambodian side. And you head across these extraordinary canals, which are still like spokes of a wheel, showing these Khmer canals across the delta. And eventually you get to Ashram Maharose, arguably the first, or certainly the first surviving Hindu temple in Southeast Asia. And inside Ashram Maharose, you get these extraordinary sculptures. It's Lord Vishnu, and yet it's not Lord Vishnu as we know him here, because he's wearing a sampot, which is the Khmer wrap, and he's looking like a Khmer. So from the beginning, the Hinduism of Southeast Asia is slightly different. Here we have Jayavarman II, who founds the Angkor Empire. But his face is attached to the body of Vishnu. Here's the discus, here is the conch. What's it doing? It's something you will never see in India. It is the king or the emperor portrayed as the god. In Chola sculpture, you'll get Lord Shiva crowning Raja Chola, but you'll never see Raja Chola as Lord Shiva, I think. Tell me if I'm wrong. Here we have what's going on. These local kings are sitting, and suddenly they're finding themselves surrounded by Brahmins who are telling them that they are not Kodunga, to take one name from one inscription, they are Mullavarman, or Suryavarman, or Mahendravarman. Because suddenly these guys are bringing in the Sanskrit language. They are telling the local rulers that they're not just a local strongman, that they are the protected one of Lord Vishnu, or Surya, or Lord Shiva. And they are bringing practical skills of administration, including the writing. This is Pallava Granthi, southern Brahmi. The northern Brahmi is written like northern Indian scripts, with a straight line and the letters coming down from the washing line. Southern scripts are written on palm leaves, so they have to be curvilinear, so you don't cut the palm. And it is the specific form of Pallava Grantha from Kanchipuram, which spreads to Southeast Asia and is the source of every single Southeast Asian script, Mon, Khmer, Thai, Pew, until the arrival of Islam. And this particular form of one version of the Brahmi script spreads throughout Southeast Asia with the Sanskrit language, so that by the 7th or 8th century, you've got Sanskrit being used every court from Kandahar to Bali. And with that comes all the Indic texts on administration, on kingship, on obviously all the religious texts themselves, but also the epics. By the 8th century, we hear that the Mahabharata is being read at court, in the Khmer court, every week. And these stories begin to seep in through puppeting, through shadow puppets, and through recitations. But what are these Brahmins doing here? What about the Kalapani? Aren't they not meant to leave India? So this provides a clue of what's going on. In ancient India, while the political landscape is always fractured into many states, the boundaries of India are recognized very clearly. To the west, the Indus; to the east, the Ganges; to the south, the sea. The sadhus in Taxila tell that to Alexander the Great when they arrive. So if you cross beyond the Ganges, you lose your caste, allegedly, according to the laws of Manu. So what do? You move the Ganges. And suddenly, the Mekong becomes Ma Ganga. It's the same word. Ma Ganga, Mekong. It's the Khmer pronunciation for Ma Ganga. And here at the source of the Siem Reap River, just to emphasize their point, someone dams the river and sculpts yonis and lingams into the riverbed. Soon you have a new Kurukshetra in Laos, a new Ayodhya outside Bangkok, and every major Shaivite temple gets renamed and replaced in Cambodia after the step pyramids of the Cambodian Shiva temples. So this whole area, the Bay of Bengal, becomes an eastern branch of India, not through conquest. This is not a military conquest, as 1930s Indian historians like R.C. Majumdar implied. There is no conquest. There is no military footprint here. It is an empire of the spirit. And it spreads through the power of ideas and the attractiveness of the ideas and the attractive power of the stories. They're so attractive that everyone wants to be part of this. The equivalent is when you walk, in my homeland, you walk through Edinburgh and you go to Princes Street and you see two Parthenons where the National Gallery are. That's not because Agamemnon conquered 18th century India. It's because the 18th century Scots so admired ancient Greek culture that they emulated it in their buildings and so on. This is what's happening here in the 7th, 8th centuries. It is an empire of the spirit. And just like you find the Parthenon reproduced at Edinburgh, Princes Street, so you find the Shaw Temple at Mamallapuram reproduced in Gedongo Songo in Java. Reproduced but not copied, because look, there's little Chinese finials, there's tall, narrow gateways. The same is true at Prambanan, where you develop a whole new style of temple. And it is here, rather than in India, that you see the first complete sculptural representation of the Ramayana. 150 panels at Prambanan, with Lord Ram, Lakshman, and the arrow, the bow shooting the golden deer, and so on. All the other scenes, they're all here. But what is interesting is that by the 8th and 9th centuries, it gets bigger than anything in India, because there grows in Southeast Asia two superstates, Srivijaya, where Indonesia now is, and the Khmer Empire, centered in Cambodia, but spilling out into Laos, Vietnam, and Thailand. And these can afford larger monuments than anything in India, which remains divided. So you find the largest Buddhist monument in the world at Borobudur, outside Yogyakarta. And most famously, you find the greatest Hindu monument in the world, Angkor Wat, in the Mekong. It is the largest medieval monument in the world. The outer moat is 4 times the size of the Vatican. It's also probably, but don't tell Mr. Modi, the largest Hindu empire in the world. But let's not go there today. But it's an extraordinary achievement. But again, very important. When Tagore goes to Angkor Wat, he sees it and he says, everywhere I could see India, yet I could not recognize her. And this is the crucial thing to understand. This is based on Indic precedents. It is an Indic religion, but it is not as we know it in India. The styles are different. There is, for example, female Brahmins in the temples of Cambodia. There is no caste. Everyone eats pork. Delicious. At the center of Angkor Wat, this quincunx, that's the shape of a 5, the central tower, contains the ashes of Suryavarman II, the founder. Now, I don't know any Hindu monument where you get the ashes of the founder in the temple, as opposed to a chhatri on the outside. So that's profoundly different from India. And when you go to Bali today, the Hinduism there is quite different to the Hinduism here. So it's not a military conquest. It's not a direct carbon copy. It's a development. It's an offspin. It's a version all of its own. Finally, the numbers. The numbers we all use today. We can all read this, 270. So we're now going back 600 years. We've been in the 12th century, in the 1120s, with Suryavarman II in Cambodia. We're now going back to 450, the golden age of the Guptas, in Madhya Pradesh. And here at Udayagiri, near Bhopal, you have this magnificent structure with Varaha emerging, dripping from the waters. This was originally a river flowing right through it. So he did emerge literally from the waters here, with Bhudevi, the earth clinging to his tusks. Here he has his foot on the Naga king, and to his right, this is the point of the whole thing, fresh from the gym where he's been working his weights, Chandragupta II, seen here on his horse. Now these guys are celebrated for a reason. This is not only the period of Kalidasa, It's also the period of the Kama Sutra. But more importantly, it is the period of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta. Aryabhatta calculates the circumference of the earth. Brahmagupta develops zero. And here we have zero in its first datable form, just a dot. And in Gwalior, suddenly you get the zero we know, the polo mint. And here's what should be taught in every school anywhere in the world, where we get our numbers. The nearest thing the human race has to a universal language is the numbers produced in this country after Brahmagupta, working out of Mount Abu in Rajasthan. It starts with Brahmi in the 1st century. It develops into something much closer to our numbers in Gwalior. And then it goes in 3 different directions. You get the Indian direction, the Sanskrit and Devanagari on the right. The East Arabic numbers, which you get still used in Saudi Arabia and Iraq and so on. And this is the vital on the left, the West Arabic numbers formed in Morocco and Spain and developing by the 16th century into the numbers we all know today. Why do we not have this taught in every school? It's an extraordinary addition to one of the foundations of world civilization. How does it all get to the Middle East? Well, probably through a Disney character. Those of you who've sat your grandchildren or children or nephews and nieces in front of Aladdin will recognize Jafar with his rather nasty parrot. And Jafar is a real character. He is the vizier of Baghdad at the time of Harun al-Rashid. And he's the 4th of the generation of a family called the Barmakids, who start off as hereditary abbots in Rajasthan, in Balkh in Afghanistan. They build Baghdad, and the first thing they do is they summon from Sind a delegation of mathematicians who bring the works of Aryabhatta and Brahmagupta to Baghdad. And these books are studied and the process of translation begins. But it's only a generation later, when Al-Khwarizmi turns up from what's now Uzbekistan, that we get an unraveling of the mysteries of these texts into something that any teenager can understand in simple Arabic prose. Al-Khwarizmi comes from Khwarazm. Khwarazm is modern Khiva in Uzbekistan. And because he's the man from Khwarazm, he's known as Al-Khwarizmi. He writes a book explaining all these extraordinary mysteries with the snappy title of the compendious book of calculating by completion and balancing according to Hindu calculation, which is too much even in Arabic to pronounce quickly. So it has a nickname, Algebra. And his name, Al-Khwarizmi, is the basis for our word algorithm. So all this spreads westwards, along with chess, incidentally, which is also passing at the same time along the same route. So here, just to finish, is a map. So we're starting off in Sind. Sindhis should feel very proud. Sindhis in the room, raise your hands. Well, oh, yes, it's thanks to you that we have the numbers that we have today. So, Sind brings the books of Brahmagupta and Aryabhatta to Baghdad. Then Al-Khwarizmi comes from Khwarazm, south of the Aral Sea, to the east of the Caspian, comes down to Baghdad, translated, and it spreads through Egypt, Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco, and Spain. And by the 9th century, Christian monks are coming to a monastery called Ripoll outside Barcelona to learn the new number system. But it still remains a matter of arcane knowledge of a few scientists. And then, 200 years later, Europe remains using Latin numbers, MCV, XV1, and all that sort of thing, right up to the 12th century. And then in the 12th century, Pisa founds a trading station in Algeria, and the notary who is sent to direct it brings his son. And luckily for us all, that son goes to the local school, learns Arabic, learns the Arabic number system, which is then just taught to teenagers, because there's these very complicated mathematical treatises of Aryabhata and Brahmagupta, which are originally written in rhyming Sanskrit poetry, just to add to the complexity of the whole thing, are now available in very simple Arabic prose. Luckily, that kid goes back to Pisa, and he is Fibonacci. And Fibonacci writes a book called the Liber Abaci that explains this for Europeans. And equally lucky, the king at the time is a man called Frederick II, who's about the kind of brightest man ever to get on the throne of any throne in Europe. He hears about this new thing, and he makes the trip all the way from Palermo to Pisa to visit Fibonacci, and he brings his court mathematicians. And they have a sort of countdown-style sort of open test of maths, and of course, Fibonacci wipes the floor. And he's called to the perfectly geometrical palace of Frederick II called Castel del Monte. And here, in yet another improbable twist to the story, he meets a Scotsman, without whom none of this would be possible. And the Scotsman is a guy called Michael Scott, and he tells Fibonacci, he reads the book, and thinks it's a work of genius. And he says, but look, pal, this is all very well, but it's a wee bit theoretical. And you've got to put in money lending, weights and measures, double accounting, and money transactions. And he does, and the second edition of the Liber Abaci goes viral across Italy. It inspires the Medici to found the Medici Bank. The great Piero della Francesca reads Fibonacci and writes 3 mathematical treatises about perspective, which is then taken by Piero della Francesca's friend Luca de Caroli, who takes it up to Milan, where he shares it with his flatmate, who's a man called Leonardo da Vinci. Whoa! So, you can also argue that it is because of this that you get the rise of the European companies, the birth of the East India Company, and it is the East India Company which uses Indian weapons against India in the 18th century. But the East India Company is another story for another time, and I've been told to shut up and leave the stage. So, thank you very much. Do we have time for questions? Or one question? We're allowed one question. Anyone else? There's one option. Hand up here. Do we have microphones?
Yes. Just one.
Who's it? This man is waving his hand frantically here. You can shout out loud.
What was the reason?
Very complicated and controversial question. Why did Buddhism die here, and why did Hinduism die in Southeast Asia? They are competitive with each other. There is no question that both are trying to attract patronage from different rulers. The usual answer given is that Buddhism, in its purest form at least, is too abstract. The Buddha's gone. And all you can hope for with Buddhism is extinction, nirvana. While Hinduism, you can go to the temple, you can have darshan, you can have sweeties, there's all sorts of good things that it's a much more, and then you've got the whole, if you're a Rajput leader, Hinduism approves of warrior virility, the whole of the Ramayana and Mahabharata support that, while Buddhism is supposedly non-violent, which is a bit of a problem if you're a warrior leader. But again, that doesn't explain why it does better in Southeast Asia and Hinduism dies out there and only survives in Bali. But there's a lot about it in the book. So I would recommend you buy the book, sir, which I will be happy to sign for you.